Hi, everybody. I'm Thomas Howard. I'm one of the ISE technical marketing engineers here at Cisco, and I wanted to talk to you today about securing your Cisco Meraki wireless with ISE. Some of you may know that we recently did one on securing your Cisco Catalyst wireless with ISE, and so this is really sort of a similar version to that, where we're doing it with Meraki to show you how ISE can work with either of Cisco's wireless platforms. And so we'll go through what some of the Meraki capabilities are, talk about doing basically all the same scenarios that we did with the Cisco Catalyst line, but we're going to be doing it for Meraki today. And so the first thing I want to mention is that ISE works not only with Cisco Catalyst and Cisco Meraki platforms, but it also works with any wireless or even wired platform, VPN platform that does Radius or TACACS. So we work with just about anything. We get this question a lot. People are wondering, does ISE work with my switch, my wireless controller, whatever it is? And there's a very large chance it does, since these protocols have been around for a good 30 years, very standard. And so yes, it probably does work with ISE. So when it comes to Meraki's hardware, if we look at the different products, so they have the MR is the wireless, the access points, the MS is the switches, and the MX is the VPN, SD-WAN router platforms. This is a quick overview of what they're able to do. So you can see we're doing wireless today, and so the Meraki MR is there at the top. That's what we're going to be talking about. So you can see that they pretty much do everything except the trust set capabilities. And so everything we're going to do today, URL redirection and change of authorization, all those fundamental underlying capabilities are supported by the Meraki wireless platforms. And when it comes to doing, security and authentication, authorization, what you usually want to do is base your level of trust and privilege, since, a lot of people, zero trust is the big thing these days, and how much trust you can put into a user or an endpoint is a very large part of that. The different credentials and types that you're able to use with different users and devices can determine that level of trust typically. And so the type of credential that you use is often commensurate with that. And that's what you're seeing here is, if it's a guest, you may not have any credentials at all. And so it's a very low level of trust, on up to an employee's asset, which you may provision a digital certificate to, so that you know that it's been a managed device and it's one of your assets and things like that. And that's where we use full 802.1x, and there's some scenarios in the middle there as well. So when it comes to doing authentication with these different credential types, we have this concept of authentication factors. Typically, it's something that like a password, something you possess, like a token or a token key or security key, something like that. And then finally, something of your being, which is more like a biometric type authentication. And each of these is known as a factor. And so you can have no factors in your authentication. You can have a single one of those, or you can combine them all together for a much stronger kind of authentication. And each one of those has their own properties in terms of how easy they are to use. And so somewhere in here is where you probably want to be with your authentication and how much trust you want to put in a user or a device based on the number of factors that it takes to authenticate with those credentials. And so, we start off a lot of times on a wireless with a completely open wireless network. That's your guest network. Sometimes we can use MAC Authentication Bypass in order to only use a MAC address in order to determine if something is a device or something that we know. And that can vary depending upon how you actually perform that authentication. What's the process for obtaining the MAC address, adding it to a database or something like that, maintaining it. And then you have things that I'm sure you're all familiar with, WPA 2 and 3. This is basically how we all do our wireless associations, usually with a pre-shared key. But because it's pre-shared, there's really no way to identify a single platform because everybody's using the same pre-shared key. And you can even have something like IPSK for multiple pre-shared keys. So now you can have multiple pre-shared keys out there, and different pre-shared keys can be used to join a wireless network. But it's a way to separate out your different wireless domains. And then there's even IPSK or identity pre-shared key or individual pre-shared key is how I like to think of it, where you have a single pre-shared key for every MAC address that's out there. And that's sort of a way to identify it, but some might say, okay, yeah, but it's still a MAC address. It can be spoofed. And so I kind of put it somewhere in between 0 and a single factor, even though there really is sort of a pre-shared key there. And then, of course, you know, the known and trusted 802.1x with the password. That's sort of our standard for where we're at today with a single factor. But of course, you can also do 802.1x with a certificate. And some people even like to do a machine authentication along with the user-based authentication with 802.1x. And some people are, you know, toying with the idea of doing multi-factor authentication with 802.1x. And you can do this. But sometimes, you know, the experience may not be the best because we have mobile devices that like to power down and hibernate and drop their session. You may roam across different access points, and that causes a re-authentication, or you may be, you know, timed out, and then your mobile phone activates again, and you got to re-authenticate, do another factor. So these multi-factors can come at very inconvenient times. And so if you're planning on doing something like that, be aware the user experience may not be the best, and for these reasons. And so that's something to think about when you're doing this. But these are the different kinds of authentications and sort of the level of trust you might want to put into them. So today we're talking about Meraki, and Meraki is a cloud managed platform. And so that we're going to be working with the Meraki Dashboard. And when you log in to Meraki through your account, you get access to the dashboard. And typically you manage one organization, but you can have multiple organizations that you belong to and you manage. And within those organizations, you have multiple networks, and those networks can range from you know, controlling your wired, wireless devices, your VPN devices, things like that. And those are all managed in here as well once you choose the network that you want to look at. And all of this can also be done via APIs. And so that's one of the great things about Meraki is you're able to basically do most of your management all through the APIs of these devices. So today we're going to be configuring our service set identifiers, or SSIDs. And with Meraki, you can do up to 15 SSIDs. And I believe this is per network. So you can, we're going to go through and we're going to edit these, and you'll see how we use them for doing our authentications today. When you do your authentications, you have different access control options. And so first, you know, starting off with the open network, that's, you know, probably where you want to start, but that's probably not where you want to end. You want to go ahead and maybe do some, this is part of WPA3, the opportunistic wireless encryption, where you can encrypt individual sessions, even though it may be an unauthenticated user. You can still have them establish a secure tunnel to prevent wireless eavesdropping, even on an open network. And then you may have your pre-shared keys that we all know and love. We can also do MAC Authentication Bypass with our Radius server like ISE. We can choose our enterprise-based authentication, which is really where you do your 802.1x. And of course, you have your individual pre-shared key. And you can even do a PSK, a pre-shared key per group policy with Meraki. So we won't be doing all of these. We'll be doing several of them. And these are the different things we're going to do. Again, this parallels what we did with the securing Cisco Catalyst. These are all the same scenarios. But there are a few differences with Meraki. You can do pre-shared keys with Meraki, as I just showed you. However, we cannot do pre-shared keys with MAC filtering or MAC authentication like we were able to do with the Catalyst platform. Meraki doesn't offer that option. They also don't allow us to do MPSK with MAC filtering through a Radius server like ISE. So we're not going to be able to do these scenarios, but we can do the open network. You could still do pre-shared keys, just not have ISE do the per MAC filtering on it. If you did want to do the per MAC stuff, you need to go with the IPSK option, which we are going to do in basically an IoT type network. And then we'll go ahead and do corporate authentication with 802.1x wired and wireless. I mean, with password and certificates. So quick review for those of you that don't know MAC Authentication Bypass. When we try to authenticate users and devices, we try to use 802.1x because that's a much stronger form of authentication, as we just talked about. But sometimes that's not always available on some devices, maybe because they don't support it. But usually what happens is, people are busy, or I like to say lazy. They don't have time to configure it, or it's just not their priority, maybe not even their job, right? You want to get those printers and cameras authenticated on your network, but that's somebody else's responsibility, and their priority is not your priority, as the network admin or the security admin. So sometimes that doesn't always happen. So what we do in those situations is we are able to use that MAC address that device inherently has on an Ethernet network. And when it connects, we will, of course, try to authenticate it with 802.1x. But if they don't respond, then what we're able to do is discover that MAC address, probably through an ARP process or the association process with wireless. And the wireless controller switch can send that over to ISE and say, hey, should I let this MAC address on? And depending upon the scenario or the service we're offering with that wireless network, we can say, sure, let's go ahead and accept that, and let's put them into a guest network, right? Or we may give them minimal access until we know more about them, until they are redirected to a WebAuth portal and authenticated that way. Or maybe it is, in fact, an IoT network or something where we do allow MAC addresses and do MAC filtering. So those are the ways we're able to do that with MAC Authentication Bypass. And then one other thing I'll mention is Meraki does have a really cool little way to go ahead and do an authentication test where we can go ahead and type in a sample username and password and find out if our Radius connection is up and running. We'll be using that today, so you can see how to do a quick test to your Radius server. So with that, I'd like to go ahead and just show you real quick how this works with an open network. So this is the Meraki dashboard. And what happens is, if you look at that organization, look at the summary report, this is the page that you see. But we do have the different networks like I talked about. This is part of my home network. This is actually my lab network. I have another one for teleworker type VPN. We have our different network options. You can see we can do Meraki MX, but for site-to-site VPNs. We have our switch capabilities. You can control the switch ports, what kind of access policies like 802.1x and MAB that you want to apply on them. For wireless, we're going to be looking at our access points and our SSIDs today. And we also have the ability to do Meraki Systems Manager for managing endpoints with certificates and payloads. We're going to look at that today as well. But let's start with wireless. Let's go look at one of the access points. And so this is a list of all the APs. I only have one on my lab network. The lab MR46. MR46 is my AP model. And so if I scroll down, you can see that my device is up to date currently. So whatever configuration changes I've made on the Meraki dashboard, they've been pushed. We're going to look at that a little bit later. You'll see approximately how long that takes when we make changes. So next we'll look at the SSIDs. So I showed you this earlier when it was unpopulated. So I already have 3 SSIDs pre-configured for guest, IoT, and corporate devices. And if we take a look at the guest one, you can see we have our guest SSID. I preface these with a dot simply because I want them to appear at the top of my SSID list compared to my neighbors. And for security, we are doing MAC-based access control. This is also an open network essentially, but we're going to be doing MAC authentication. And then for a splash page, what we're going to do is notice that we're not doing direct access. We are going to send them over to ISE to do the MAC authentication, determine if it should be allowed in or not. It is a way of doing MAC filtering. And then we are going to be doing a walled garden so that we can block access except to our ISE device. So my ISE server is actually in AWS in this demo today. And there's the IP address. If you guys went to it right now, you'd actually be able to land on the login page for it. And same for our accounting service on port 1813. That's ISE as well. With our pre-shared password radius secret, we can do up to 3 devices. And we can see that we have the option to do radius tests where it just sends request to see that the session's up and running, and we can do radius COA as a supported feature. Meraki uses the airspace ACL name. It can also use the filter ID and radius to send back the Meraki group policy for authorization, and that's pretty much it. So inside of ISE, I just want to show you, I'm actually using ISE 3.2, which just came out of beta, and I'm waiting for it to hit cisco.com real soon. If you guys want to try that, we did a bunch of videos on ISE 3.2 if you want to see those on our YouTube channel or in the learning community. If we go look at our settings, the first thing I like to do whenever I do these kinds of demos and I'm trying to show things and do troubleshooting, I like to go to the radius protocol settings and disable the suppress repeated failed clients and successful authentication. So I want to see all those things. As I'm testing things out, I'm trying them, I like to turn those things off temporarily. In high production, you probably want to make sure those things are enabled, but for this, in a test environment, it's good to do this. I have my network device, my MR46, like I said. That's the only thing here on my network devices today that we'll be using. And if we go take a look at our sample identities, I have one internal user, Thomas. That's part of the employees group. But we also do have some other endpoint groups configured. I created one for audio-visual devices, created one for facilities devices, the generic IoT endpoint group, as well as some for Raspberry Pis and digital signage, and some thermostats, just to show you the, kind of the options and some examples of how you might use endpoint identity groups. We'll do that a little bit later. Then what we want to do is show you that we have a guest portal configured. So we're going to do a WebAuth to do an acceptable user policy with our Hotspot guest portal. And it's a real simple flow. We just want to basically have the user accept a user policy. We're not going to go through full guesting today. Just wanted to show you that ISE can do web authentication with wireless. And what we've done is basically done a quick customization of the portal just to add the word webinar in there so you can see that when we get redirected to it, it's not the default one. It's one that we've slightly customized. All right. So that's what it's going to look like when we redirect. And let's get to our policy. This is the more interesting part. So I've pre-configured some policies. We're going to start with the guest Wi-Fi. So we're doing wireless MAB, and we're looking for an SSID ending with the .guest. We're going to do MAC Authentication Bypass. And when we receive that MAC address, we're going to authenticate it by checking to see if it was in the internal endpoints database. If it's not there, that effectively counts as an authentication fail. So we're just going to continue, even if it's not there, that's okay, because it's an open network. It's okay if it just keeps going and we don't drop it. And then we're going to check if it is, if it does MAC authentication, great. Just give it internet access. Really simple. And for some reason, if that doesn't work, we're going to deny it. But it should always go through to internet only. We're not doing any MAC filtering on this one. So what we want to do then is let's open up our live logs. I don't know why I keep hitting that. Let's go into our live logs here. Just open up a new tab so that we can flip back and forth quickly without having to wait for the pages to load. This is my iPad, and we're going to go ahead and connect to that guest network. And so it should just work, right? It's open MAB as long as ISE lets us in. We're not doing any MAC filtering here. We could, but we're not going to, or have any other policies. So you can see that we hit that guest Wi-Fi default authentication. We hit the open authorization rule and applied internet only access. So our iPad should be able to just get right onto the network and go to any website, and it should just work. And there you go. All right, so that's your basic open guest SSID, but we're still going through ISE. So what we want to do now is slightly customize this for doing something like web authentication using an acceptable user policy. So let's flip back here and let's take a look at guest. So ISE has 3 different types of guests that you can do. One is the hotspot, which we're about to do. You can do self-registered guests where they put in some authentication or personal information about themselves, mobile phone, email, things like that. Or you can have a sponsored guest access where somebody else needs to create the account, maybe a lobby ambassador or some other employee that they're coming to see, maybe somebody hosting an event. But we can do all these different types of things within ISE and manage the users. Even via API, we can do this as well. And so when we customize things, if we're talking about Meraki, it also has the ability to do like a hotspot splash page. And so we can come in and we can customize it a little bit, just like you can do with ISE. And so the splash page customization, these are basically your options. You can control the different themes and colors and basic messages, logo, things like that. But the reason why you probably want to do this with ISE is because ISE has a lot more customization options, right? The ability to have a common splash page between wired and wireless and maybe even different Meraki networks. You can point them all at a single ISE server and have a common look and feel, process, everything like that. So those are some of the reasons why you'd maybe want to use ISE, even though Meraki does offer a basic hotspot login option capability. Like I said, the customization is pretty easy, where you can control the process and the flow of all the different things, the different types of information you want to collect from the user. Do you want to do URL redirection? Do you want to just send them off to the previous URL they were looking at? That's the guest originating URL feature. So we can do all these things, get a preview of it, customize it, and we can do what we call central web authentication. So the way this works is we have our user that wants to come into the wireless network, and they'll try to associate. And if we know they're going to a particular SSID, like a guest network, we'll just say, sure, come on in. We will assign typically an access control list and perform a URL redirection. That's basically that walled garden functionality on the Meraki side. And when they open up a web browser, they'll get redirected to the ISE login page, or in the case of the WebAuth authentication that we're going to do, it's not really an authentication, and we just want them to accept a user policy before we let them use the internet access. And so if they went ahead and authenticated or they accept that user policy, we can do a radius change of authorization on that session to open them up from that Meraki walled garden or change that access control list on Cisco Catalyst. We will then have when the network device receives that change of authorization, it will say, okay, ISE, what would you like me to do with this user now? And we'll say, let them go on out to the internet and give them full access out there. And that's how we do it. So that's central web authentication. And so what we're going to do now is basically a form of WebAuth where it's basically a guest acceptable user policy, where we have that same open MAB authentication that we were just doing, but now we're going to add this concept of a MAC filter. All right, so here's how we do that. So we were looking at the ISE policies, and what we want to do now is I'm going to change this existing guest Wi-Fi policy that we had. What we're going to do is I'm just going to enable this guest WebAuth, and what this is going to do, it's also going to do MAB, but now instead of opening up to the internet, we're going to redirect them to the portal in ISE for the acceptable user policy. And once they accept that, they'll be a member of it'll trigger the guest flow, which means they're part of the internet guest users, and then they'll go to the internet. So we've made that change, and because those rules are higher up in the list, they'll get hit before our other open access. So if we look at what those are in our authorization profiles, what you'll see is we have the guest WebAuth redirect and internet only. So guest WebAuth redirect basically is going to redirect them to the ISE portal, and it looks like this. So there's our redirection. From the drop-down list for redirection, we have our hotspot. You could choose this where you would choose central WebAuth or other things. The Meraki ACL does not apply here, so I just put the word none just to fill in the blank. And that's because we're using the Meraki walled garden instead. Otherwise, we have the hotspot guest portal that we're going to redirect them to with the redirection URL, and you can see all those details down here. Okay? So once we redirect them and they accept the user policy, you want to send them out to the internet only. And that's just done through a Meraki group policy. So here's that walled garden feature I was telling you about. So you can see I've enabled it and I've let them only get to my ISE node that's sitting out in AWS today. So if we go back to the authorization policy, I'll show you the internet only real quick. And we'll scroll down, and this is where you should see that airspace ACL name, okay? That's internet only. And so what happens is when we respond in that access accept from Radius with ISE, we're going to access accept it, and we're going to send the phrase internet only over to Meraki, and they're going to use that to match up with the existing group policies in Meraki. So we can look at our group policies here in this network. You can see that I have a bunch of group policies already configured, and one of them is internet only. And you can see some different rules that I've configured to let them access the ISE node, but I don't want them talking to my internal network. And so I've denied the RFC 1918 addresses once we let them in. I only want them talking to the internet. So there we go. I left all the other settings basically as the defaults. So nothing else changed there. And so if you wanted, you could do, filtering by URL and things like that based on the SSID and the type of content you may or may not want to allow. So what we're going to do is we've got our ISE live logs, and I want to come back in here now, and I want to try to change our guest Wi-Fi. So I want to come in here and just forget the previous SSID. And then rejoin, forget it first, and let's rejoin the guest network. And now, because the policy is different, look at that, it popped it up. That's our URL redirection to the ISE hotspot portal for acceptable user policy. The connection was successful, and we can now get out to the internet. What you're going to see now is if we go look at our groups, what happened is when we did that MAC filtering for the guest, ISE put the MAC address of the endpoint in the guest endpoints group. And so that's how we did the MAC filtering. So any MAC address that you put in here manually or ISE puts in here, that is considered a guest device and part of that guest flow in our policy. So remember, the way we did this is we had them go through the guest flow. What that means is that's basically a shortcut for saying, is this MAC address in the guest endpoints identity group in ISE? And then if so, let them out to the internet. That's what's going on there. Okay, so that's how we were able to do WebAuth real quick. Now the next thing I want to show you is, or at least talk to you about, is pre-shared keys. So the idea of pre-shared keys is that all these different devices can share a known secret, a secret that's been shared, and if they know the secret, then they're able to come on into the network. Now, as I said, you can do this with Meraki, but not with ISE. You don't have that ability to have it authenticate essentially the user or device with that pre-shared key and then send it over to ISE via Radius for MAC filtering. The Catalyst devices can do it, but not the Meraki devices. So we're not actually going to show you that today. But the other thing that you can do is PSK grouping, where you can have different devices share those things. You can actually do that inside of Meraki using just the Meraki cloud, but again, it won't send it over to ISE, but they do have a similar capability. So real quick, basically I want to show you what this looks like in Meraki. So if we look at the wireless, you can see we have a .iot SSID doing PSK. So if we look at these settings real quick, we've enabled the SSID, and you can see we have the ability to do a pre-shared key with Meraki. So if we put that in there, then any users that know the pre-shared key will be able to associate to this SSID. But notice that when that is checked, if we come down to the splash page, how we're going to do it, Notice that it's just direct access, and we do not have the ability to talk to ISE. So Meraki doesn't offer this. It's not available. It's disabled when you choose the pre-shared key option. So instead, if we wanted to do individual pre-shared key, we could do that with Meraki. So we need to check that box, come down, and now we have the ability to use ISE for that that MAC filtering or individual pre-shared key authentication. Okay, so I just wanted to show you that real quick. And if we go look at our access point, notice I made a change, and I want you to see how, since this is cloud managed, notice that Meraki says, yeah, I know you changed it, but our config is currently out of date. It hasn't quite synced with our access point yet. So you can see that it's still out of date, but if we refresh the screen and scroll back down, well, it's still out of date. Hasn't quite updated yet. No, not yet. So you can see sometimes it usually takes, 60 seconds to 2 minutes before it updates. In this case, I actually had it go for like 4 minutes. It was a long, long time. And so I wanted to show you that I basically sped that up because I didn't want to make you guys sit here and wait for 4 minutes for this thing to take effect. But when I recorded this, it was well over 3 minutes to do the update. So be aware of that detail when you go to push a change. Usually it's quite fast. I found within 30 seconds, but sometimes it can take a little longer. So just be aware of that if you find yourself troubleshooting and not wondering why some things didn't quite work. So you just saw us go in and make the change for the identity PSK. And the idea here is every device can have a unique pre-shared key. And they could even share the same key to be part of effectively the same group. But that's what we're going to be doing, is we want to be able to have each MAC address that comes in only work with a specific pre-shared key. So the way this works is with Catalyst, if you watch the previous webinar, we use a Cisco VSA, a radius vendor specific attribute. We send in the phrase PSK equals some phrase, but in the case of Meraki, they use a different radius attribute. They use the radius tunnel password, and you don't need to put the PSK prefix in there. You can just put the passphrase or the pre-shared key. So that's how we do it with Meraki. And let's take a look at how we do that. So if we want to do this, we left off with our change that we made for individual pre-shared key for the IoT network. And so I just want to show you the rest of the settings here real quick. So we have IPSK enabled, right? And in this case, we can go ahead and do 802.11w if it supports it. That's fine. We'll enable that. And then we have ISE, of course, we just did. Here's our radius authentication. For the splash, we're not going to do any redirection. We don't need a walled garden because in this case, ISE is going to be doing the authentication, and they're either going to be in or out. It's not going to be any URL redirect. So we have our ISE for authentication and accounting. We have radius test. We have change of authorizations required, so you can't change that. We're going to be using that airspace ACL name again, and there you go. Real simple change. So for the IoT Wi-Fi, this is our new policy we're going to match. If we have a wireless MAB request and it's coming in on the IoT SSID, we're going to do MAB. And for the authentication policy, same thing as on the other one. If it's in the internal database, go ahead and let it in. If it's not, that's okay. Just continue down and we'll try to authenticate or authorize it. We'll see what it matches. So in this case, I have several different rules here that we're going to go through. The default is to deny. I'm going to be adding some Raspberry Pis, and by default, if we at least match the OUI, we're going to apply an IPSK for digital signage authorization rule. If it matches an endpoint policy, a profiling policy in ISE for Raspberry Pi device. Cool, that's great. And we're going to map it against the PSK for the digital signage. We could also check to see if it's in an endpoint identity group. And if it's in the endpoint identity group for digital signage, we'll match it against that PSK as well. Another option is to look at the custom endpoint attributes for a device. And if it's in facilities, we're going to apply a slightly different one. So I have two Raspberry Pis. One is for digital signage and one is a facilities device. And we're going to apply two different IPSKs based on whether it's digital signage or endpoint attributes. So I don't know what happened to that video, but for some reason it did not get added in here. So I don't have a way to show you that very easily right now. So I'm sorry about that. I don't have that clip of actually performing those things. But what I can probably do real quick is, let me see if I can bring up my Icebox and show you what those look like. What I want to do is, in my policy, we had IoT Wi-Fi, and we have all of our different rules here. What I wanted basically to show you is when something matches this IPSK signage, what is happening, what I wanted to show you was the authorization rule. Policy, results, and let's go into authorization profiles. This is what I wanted to show you. We have the PSK signage and we have the one for the endpoint attribute. Real quick, what this looks like is we can do that radius tunnel password option in the attributes section, and we put in the pre-shared key for Meraki. And then if this was a Catalyst device, it uses that PSK mode equals ASCII, and then they have a second pre-shared key with that PSK equals whatever the pre-shared key is. So that's what it looks like. So you can do both Meraki and Catalyst all with the same. You can both reuse that same authorization rule. Then if we go look at the IPSK for endpoints, what I wanted to show you real quickly is we have the ability to use that same radius tunnel password, but what I was doing special here is I was actually using the endpoints IPSK option, because we can actually map the IPSK value to some other attribute, and in this case I'm using endpoints IPSK. So what we're doing is using a custom endpoint attribute, and that's actually the subject of our next webinar. And that's why I want to put these together, because I thought this would probably generate some questions and see how you could use other custom endpoint attributes in your ISE policies. So let's go see what that looks like real quick. So if we go into administration and look at our identity groups, and we go down to our digital signage, what I did is I actually added, you can add in a MAC address, just like we did for the guest endpoints. ISE, once they click that acceptable user policy, then ISE added that MAC address to this identity, to the guest identity groups. I've basically done the same thing. I've manually assigned this MAC address to the signage endpoint group, and that's how the ISE would know that this device is a member of the identity group for signage, and then it would map that IPSK to it. And if the pre-shared key that it gave us in the authentication request matched, then we would let it on. We would know, yes, this is one of our devices, and it knows the pre-shared key. So it's a great way to do kind of a really good double authentication, or should I say two factors. It knows something and we know it by the MAC address as well. So there's that. The other thing I wanted to share with you is that idea of custom attributes. And where you configure custom attributes is here in endpoint custom attributes. Those are the user custom attributes. here. So we have the ability to come into ISE and you can add different custom attributes. So you see I've done one for who's the owner of this device, what department does it belong to, maybe it expires after a period of time, I need to remove it out of this list. If it has a individual pre-shared key, maybe when it was added to the database. And you manage this all through the endpoint database in ISE. So if you go to context visibility, you can see all these different devices in here. And if you look over here to how we've authorized these devices, we have the one for signage and the one for facilities. I didn't do anything special for signage, but for facilities, if I go take a look at this endpoint, you can see it mapped as a match the Raspberry Pi device for profiling. If I go look at this device and I look at its attributes, and I look into the custom attributes field, what you'll notice is I actually went through and added the facilities as the department, so I knew that which department it belonged to, and you can see I mapped this as the IPSK value. And so in that authorization rule, we were looking to see if it was if it had this custom attribute for department, if it matched the word facilities, and the IPSK, whatever the IPSK value is, that is what we use to authenticate that it was our device. So it shared that IPSK value with the wireless controller in Meraki, or the AP in Meraki, and we authenticated it with this IPSK value in the custom attributes. So that's how we do IPSK. All right. So I just wanted to show you that real quick. Sorry that wasn't there as part of the video. I could have fixed that. But next we want to do 802.1x. So real quick, the way that works is we have user or device wants to come into the network, and of course we challenge them for their credentials, and when they accept it, then we're able to build an EAP tunnel with a secure tunnel to pass those credentials over. So the user, in this case, username password, gets bundled up into an 802.1x frame as part of the EAP package there. We send that over. The wireless controller or access point, in this case, will bundle that into a radius packet now with these different attributes so that we know what's the calling station ID, the called station ID, what type of service or SSID are they requesting, and other attributes that we may want to know. ISE is then able to take those attributes and those credentials and perform a quick authentication against an external identity store like Active Directory or Azure Active Directory or LDAP. And if the credentials match, then we're able to get the group information and know what level of privilege or authorization should we apply to them in the ISE policy. And we're able to map that into an authorization profile like you saw with the access accept and maybe a URL redirect or some other Meraki group policy name, something like that. We'll go ahead and send that back, and the access device will go ahead and take those attributes, update the session appropriately for enforcement, and then let the user know that they can come on into the network. Or not if it doesn't work out for some reason. We can also use not only username password, but we can do certificate authentication profiles to verify the different attributes inside of a digitally signed certificate. And so we have different things that we can check for. By default, it's the subject common name. And when we're talking about some of these devices, we typically want to provision these things. When it comes to provisioning, especially endpoints by themselves, you have to do some custom configuration using some other tool. So in the case of Windows, you may need to use a group policy object. For Mac OS, you may need to use the Apple configurator. Of course, you can use AnyConnect NAM for provisioning credentials that way. Maybe Google Suite if you're using an Android device. Of course, ISE can also provision things as part of the BYOD flow. And we also have Meraki System Manager for doing general MDM, mobile device management, or enterprise mobility management functions. So whatever the platform is, you may need to do some other things to push those certificates to those endpoints so they know what to be using there. In the case of Meraki SM, you have a bunch of different ways that you can do this. You can provision some payloads, and I'm going to show you what that looks like right now. So we have our corporate SSID. that we want to authenticate to. And if I look at the settings to see how it's configured, there's that .corp, that's what the SSID, it's enabled. We're going to do enterprise authentication with our radius server, which is, of course, ISE. We have the 802.11 enabled. We're going to not do any kind of splash page redirection. We're just going to straight up use our radius server, and whatever it says is what we're going to use. So in this case, you can see authentication port 1812, accounting 1813. We're going to do a radius test to make sure our connection is okay. Now, we've already tested this. We know it's good, but I just want to show you this option if you're doing it for the first time. There you go. AP's passed. Cool. And even if it fails, it's okay. Sometimes you go back and look in the ISE live log and see, at least if the connection is there, that's good. You may have a bad rule. You need to rewrite that authorization profile, but otherwise, it should work. We're going to use that airspace ACL name. And for advanced radius settings, I don't think we need anything there. It should all the defaults should be just fine, and that should be good. Oh no, did it not do it again? Oh, my video cut off again. So no, it's in here. I don't know why it stopped. What we want to do is, here we go. All right, so if we go here, I don't know why it stopped. We're going to go into ISE. You can see that the test authentication used that MAC address. If you see that MAC address, know that it's the Meraki test. It did go ahead and match my internal ID, my internal username inside of the ISE database. That's why it was accepted. But in this case, we actually want to do a .1x authentication with my iPad. So I'm going to type in my credentials with my iPad. You don't get to see my password though. And once that works, once I finish typing, I'll hit join. And if it doesn't know the certificate, it may need to be trusted. This one's not digitally signed, so or by a public CA. That's why it's prompting me for that. It looks like we were able to get to the network. Let's go hit a URL, and it works. Okay, cool. So that is basic username password authentication for an SSID with Meraki. Okay, so you can see on my information, I used PEEP. I matched against the internal ISE user database. That's all good. And so now what we want to do is we want to go ahead and try and do this with a certificate. So if we go back to Systems Manager and the Meraki Dashboard, take a look at our settings. What I want to show you is we have configured a payload here. So there's a couple things that we include. They've got the profile configuration is corp TOS. So we're going to associate to the .corp SSID. We're going to apply it to my iPad. I'm going to manually push a certificate to it. I'm going to join the corp SSID. When I do, I'm going to use TLS as the authentication protocol. And you can see I've chosen an identity certificate that I'm going to use. And if I needed to do any kind of certificate authority specific things in there, I could do that as well. Otherwise, I'm going to use this digital certificate, and we need to push it to my iPad. And for that, we go to Add Devices, and again, supports lots of different devices, and there's multiple ways that you can add a device. I went ahead and I used the QR code, so I was able to just point my camera from my iPad at it and get redirected to enroll in this site. It wants to know what network ID you used. In this case, it's my domain trust0-sm for System Manager. So we start and say, yeah, this is, we're part of this network from Meraki. So I can do this from home or anywhere. But in this case, it's saying, but I want to know who you are. So I need you to log in with Azure. And so I go through the Azure authentication process. This is basically just a way to make sure that it's one of our users. Okay. Oh, it didn't work. Let's try it again. Okay, cool. That worked. It had my credentials cached, so we knew how to do it. So what we want to do now is go ahead and download the Meraki SM profile into ICE. I'm sorry, into my iPad. For that, we then need to go into my system settings and under General, look at the VPN device management, and you can see there's a profile that's been downloaded. We need to tell it to be installed, verify that we really, really, really want to install it. It's pushing that certificate down right now. That profile will be installed. Are you sure you really want to allow this person to manage your computer? Yeah, I do. This is typical of a BYOD process, right? Or a managed asset process. So now it's done. Profile's been installed. Let's take a look at it. So here is the full payload that we downloaded. We pushed some digital certificates so that we can trust those. We have some mobile device manager properties. It actually is going to associate to the SSID for .corp. And if I click on the .corp SSID, notice it's up in my networks now because it's already part of that trusted payload. It's not down under other networks anymore. And that should work. Looks like we've authenticated using a certificate this time. We didn't get prompted for a username and password. Let's see if internet access works. Yes, it does. Okay. Let's go back and take a look at the authentication in ICE. There we go. All right. So you can see that we have, before we had our username password was done with PEEP in our internal database. In this case now it's Thomas. It has the full user principal name or common name from the certificate as my identity. And we matched my Apple device. We did 802.1x with EAP-TLS, and we matched in the 802.1x policy for employees for Trust Zero. So we actually authenticated with our Azure Active Directory domain. So that's how we were able to do 802.1x with both username, password, and digital certificates with ICE and Meraki. All right. So with that, just about done. And I wanted to remind everybody that we have a lot of other ICE webinars out there. If you missed the previous one on using Cisco Catalyst wireless with ICE, we have that out there. We have a lot of other things. I mention this because we get people that send comments. We love your comments in the webinar reviews that Rigo sends out. I always read every one of them. So if you have other ideas of things you want, please let us know. But know that we have a lot of things out there that you may be looking for. We put it in our YouTube channel. Rigo maintains the community for the Cisco Learning Network if you want to watch it that way. So we have lots of great things for you to find out. And we always post these things about a week after these webinars. So be looking for that if you want to watch it again. Or if I went through something a little too fast for you, you can slow it down and walk through it in your own lab or something. So with that, these are kind of all of our different webinar resources. You get to the YouTube videos, all of our resources on our Cisco communities, and the guides that we talk about. We have a guide for configuring all the Meraki devices with ICE, and so everything you need should be out there. So hopefully this was good. Rigo, did we have any outstanding questions that I can try to answer?
Hey, Thomas, great presentation. We just have one outstanding question that just came in.
Okay.
The question is, what was the ACL name that the Meraki products use?
The ACL name. So what happens is it doesn't really use an ACL name. What happens is I think they mean the airspace ACL name. So it does use an ACL name, but it doesn't really apply. It's not really an ACL name in the case of Meraki. It's a group policy name. So what you saw us do is in the case of the pre-shared keys and the the guest WebAuth, is we basically told it to apply an internet only. It was an airspace ACL name, but really it was a Meraki group policy name called internet only. So we told Meraki in that attribute, apply the group policy name internet only, and you saw how the internet only had an access control list already pre-configured in the Meraki dashboard. So I configured all of that. And then if I wanted to do additional things like URL filtering, that's an additional feature that Meraki has built into it. So not only would it do a layer 3, layer 4 access control list, but it would also do, potentially layer 7 type things with different websites. So those are the kinds of capabilities that you can do there. So hopefully that helps answer it. But it wasn't technically an access control list name. It was a Meraki group policy name, but it happened to go through the airspace access control list attribute in Radius.